So the review can be found, of course, at imixwhatilike.org and is titled Stokely, a review of our premier interpreter of Black Power studies. It was originally published back May 7th, 2015, shortly after Peniel Joseph's book came out. And I'll just start reading right here. So I start with a reference to Skip Coon, one of my favorite MCs, and his great work in this track here. He talks about, now what if I could have heard Stokely Carmichael yelling Black Power for the first time? I write rhymes to the rhythm of my heartbeat, pretending these hi-hats is shells dropping to the street, end quote. It's a great track off their first album. I have to find the link and put it in the description for this as well, including our interviews and discussions with Skip Coon about that. I'll put the link in the description to that as well. Peniel Joseph once upon a time proclaimed himself the father of Black Power studies, leading at one point Bob Brown to raise the question, if you are the father, who then is the mother? And again, this came from when we had Bob Brown, of course, who worked for the longest of time in the Black liberation struggle, and of course with Kwame Ture and in the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And around this time, I had invited Bob to Morgan State University to give a talk about his life and his work, and of course, Kwame Ture. And Peniel and his work, of course, came up, and Bob made this statement to our audience there. Again, if you are the father, who is the mother of Black Power studies? And sort of, joking him a little bit as how could this younger man, or how could anybody proclaim themselves as such? But branding is important. And I've said about his colleague, that is Joseph's colleague, Zahir Ali, famously associated with Manning Marable's Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. Again, Zahir Ali told me to my face that he wanted his association with Marable's book to help build his own brand. So branding is important in academia as much as anywhere else, and often for the same ignoble reasons and purposes. Anyway, though he has now rephrased that is, Peniel rephrased himself as now the founder, the initial paternalism in the original claim cannot itself be scrubbed from Joseph's continued approach to Black Power, and with it, ideas of revolution. Stokely, A Life is more of the same pattern established in his previous work, Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama, paternalistic, dismissive, diminution, oh my God, I can't even read my own writing. Paternalistic, dismissive, diminution, diminishing is the point of even the idea of revolution or more. His seems like the lamentations of an aggrieved parent disappointed at what could have been had the child just grown out of its previous political state of nature. Joseph calls his focus on Stokely Carmichael a, quote, an act of recovery, though it seems to be more a resurrection for the purpose of further condemnation. Carmichael, the previous evil, red threat to national security, now resuscitated, serves to reaffirm the current good, or at least better, and functions also to establish an acceptable interpretation of the past and of formerly threatening people, groups, and ideas. And if you ever read Dark Days, Bright Nights, From Black Power to Barack Obama, that was actually so we were at, oh man, all of us were there. I think Dr. Burroughs was with me. Dr. Haight was around, and we were at this symposium at the Smithsonian where Sonia Sanchez and Amiri Baraka were the headliners, and Peniel Joseph was moderating a discussion with them. And I had already read Peniel's work. I think we had already had our debate by that point. Or was it after that? Was it after that book came out? I think it was after that, actually, the debate came out, or that we had our debate. Oh man, I have to go double check that. But already I and we and several others were already clear from reading Joseph's earlier work and some of his articles where he was trying to go. And I had actually interviewed him previously at the request of WPFW for another event before I really recognized what was happening. And at the time, I didn't really think his work was a problem. It was clear he was wanting to be a professional academic writing about Black history and Black power and all of this. But at the time, waiting till the midnight hour and a couple of the other journal articles I had read, I didn't feel like he was doing quite what he would later, I think, come to do. He was sort of building towards to where we are here. But we're at this symposium, and so my point is that we had like I had my own connections indirectly to Amiri Baraka and through Tom Porter. So during at this event, I remember we talked to Baraka and tried to pull him aside and say, like, basically, I was trying to politely say, can you please be careful of your association with Peniel Joseph, because you're co-signing somebody who's, I think, headed in a kind of a different political direction and looking to brand himself as something he's not. And in association with him, at these kinds of events, it just further yeah, I mean, the co-signing, it further eases the process. And I think this is a problem actually that we have with a lot of our elders. And I'm seeing it happen with my own generation vis-a-vis the younger generation. A lot of us try to position ourselves with the hot new rising wave so that we can get a renewed sense of appreciation. And I think some of even our best have fallen into that a little bit. And this was one of the moments that, where you can't really know who you're fully associating with. Obviously, we're all appreciating being appreciated. So anyway, but we tried. I did try, a couple of us did try to reach to Barack and make that point. But at that event, also, Peniel Joseph, I ended up talking with him, and he showed me the cover of that because it hadn't been published yet, of the what is it called again? Dark Days, Bright Nights, from Black Power to Barack Obama. And it had on the cover the picture of Malcolm X and Barack Obama, suggesting that Malcolm had led and paved the way for a Barack Obama who was an extension of Malcolm X, as opposed to what I and others were saying, as that Obama was the antithesis, the negation of a Malcolm X. So already I was saying, I'll look forward to reading your book, my man, but I think we're going to disagree. And he was like, oh, yeah, so that's right. That's how it went. And then later we would have that debate about that book. But and the book is, I think, does to Malcolm and that whole line of politics what Peniel is doing here, again, under the guise of a Black Power study, field of study, and sort of an attempt, as he claims, an act of recovery for Kwame Ture. So anyway, there is always the question of intended audience when considering publications of any kind. Here it would appear again that those who Stokely intends to reach are perhaps the fully uninitiated, mainstream bestsellers list-making, mostly affluent white audiences. Perhaps worse still, the targets are those who might actually be inspired to continue or increase a political struggle around Touré's actual ideas, analyses, or programmatic suggestions. In the case of the former, it is to be expected and is not a primary concern. However, Joseph's self-promotion, especially in those circles who have self and external promotion, especially in those circles who have impact on African, Black, potentially radical communities, makes the latter particularly problematic. Compounding the potential damage are the accolades bestowed by such luminaries as Gerald Horne, who says, quote, Joseph has long been acknowledged as our premier interpreter of Black power. Or Robin D.G. Kelly, who says that Joseph brings Touré's radical ideas into clear focus. However, perhaps if we use this misplaced praise as important points of departure, we can salvage some value. That is, how does our premier interpreter of Black power, I'm sorry, that is, how does our premier interpreter interpret Black power? How does Joseph bring Touré's radical ideas into clear focus? I did try to reach out. I've asked Drs. Horne and Kelly if they would ever want to have a discussion with me about what I've said here, uh, as I've mentioned before, Horn is not interested in that. I don't, and Kelly, I think politely just said, "I've read your review." He described it as quote excellent. I do remember that in the email, but was not looking for, and he may have just been polite, but he was just not interested in a public discussion of this. But I actually think it's a major problem when people who do great work, like Kelly, like Horn, co-sign people like this. Is the same point I was trying to make to Baraka. Now, I know I'm just Jared, and I don't have the, understandably so, I have not earned, I even acknowledge that. I don't think I've earned, academically speaking, the cachet that would force, or a Horn or a Kelly, um or somebody of that stature to engage me on this question. But I do think it is a problem. I think that when it's the same thing, everything, it's the same logic when nominally radical rappers or anyone else does a commercial in support of some capitalist project, it undercuts their symbolism as radical. And I think when major figures like Horn and Kelly support this kind of work, it undercuts the ability of a radical critique, and a proper understanding of the subject. And it's just, but anyway, I don't, so anyway, I did try to reach out. I have, over the years, a couple of times tried to engage, but there's not a lot of interest in that. So, anyway, we proceed. Initially, there is, as I've argued previously, Joseph's attempt to define Black power along Nixonian lines, where Black power and therefore notions of progress can be determined by the existence of Black individuals with high incomes and some amount of Black elected officials. Joseph had already established his approach to Black power in Dark Days, where in a previous radio exchange with him, I argued and continue to contend that to justify a support for the politics of Barack Obama and the process by which he was elected, Joseph must and does accept the redefinition of Black power developed by Richard Nixon. That is, just as Nixon sought to separate Black power from its most radical internationalist, anti-capitalist, Pan-Africanist origins and applications by redefining power strictly on capitalist and mainstream electoral political terms, Joseph accomplishes the same by previously describing the very corporate Barack Obama as an extension of Black power, and now here by concocting a post-civil rights collective Black political maturation that grew up appropriately and independently to adopt the mainstream political behavior. In each case, the most threatening elements of Black power are dismissed entirely or incorporated as a kind of pre-civilized prologue in an ever-progressing part of the national tale. In fact, as if to confirm this view, Joseph does tell us that Touré's story is indeed a uniquely American one. Ugh. I'm sorry. Every time I read that, it's just, ugh. So again, it's that American exceptionalism argument. America is so special and exceptional that even when it creates the worst horrors of the human experience, people can rise up out of that and become part of a uniquely American tale that emerges and extends ever forward and progressively towards some new height of civilized freedom and liberation and democracy. Then in Stokely, Touré's radical ideas are clarified as the ideas of a stubborn professional revolutionary who refused to keep up with an ever maturing Black political opinion. You all, I mean, if you haven't read Stokely, and I don't encourage it, again, maybe kind of like what we've been saying, and shout out again to Brother Ramiro, these have to be done in collectives. It was terribly damaging to have read this book on my own. And the way Joseph, because he's a good writer, skillfully, just subtly takes so many shots and dismissive reductions and abuses of what Touré continues to mean. And by calling him, as he does, a professional revolutionary and all this kind of stuff, it's just so irritating and demeaning. One method of this clarification is Joseph's confining his focus to Thérèse's early life, diminishing and distinguishing in particular his final decades by consistent reference to them as being filled with a creeping unpopularity, and by also suggesting that Black people willingly chose to collectively move away from Thérèse and his ideas. Stokely Carmichael was rightfully popular primarily because he helped to transform American democracy in the 1960s, but there is no real need to consider Kwame Ture, whose democratic vision receded, worn down by white backlash, as he became mesmerized by a global vision that combined revolutionary Pan-Africanism with third world anti-imperialism. I mean, he says, that is, Joseph uses this phrase here, transform American democracy, radically transform, progressive, whatever. So many times throughout the book, it is annoying, frankly. And as I'll try to argue later in this piece, I mean, it's a clear antithetical approach to Thérèse's life and work, even as he's claiming to be performing an active recovery, as if the man needed it. Anyway, Joseph cannot clarify Thérèse's evolving politics, in part because Joseph finds them of little value and is perhaps not politically or intellectually situated in such a manner to give insight or add depth to the range of ideas engaged by Thérèse. Mostly, of course, much like Spike Lee's Malcolm X, by the time he gets to that part of the man's chronology, the book is finished. He simply strategically leaves his focus on Carmichael, leaving no time for Thérèse. Even in a friendly review written by William Jelani Cobb, some of this is recognized. As Cobb writes, Joseph's perspective on this is scarcely cloaked. Choosing to title the biography Stokely is an implicit rejection of the phase of Carmichael's life that began when he left the United States and became Kwame Ture, adopting the names of the African heads of state, Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Ture. Indeed, the last 30 years of his life, the years largely spent abroad before his death in 1998, are dealt with a single chapter and an epilogue. I don't know if it's even fair, now that I'm even rereading this, I don't even know if it's fair to describe Ture as spending most of his life abroad in the last 30 years. I mean, he was everywhere. He was certainly here in the United States often. He was everywhere. And in his own words, Ture said, when you give your life to the people, even in your greatest time of need, the world movement will help you. Now, I suspect he was putting a little bit of a glossy edge on that, but that was his point. So he was everywhere. And to my point, I feel like he is just today as impactful and relevant and referred to and important and central in radical circles as he ever was. But Joseph is not in those circles. He's in circles where, as I showed the other day on Instagram, people, the scene from the show, the TV show SWAT, where he's in the circles where people still take shots at Black Panthers as violent militants and all that kind of nonsense. And, as dismissive, violent militants and criminals, anyway. Dismissively referring to them in that way, I should say. All right. Supporting his method, Joseph includes, as referenced interviews in his book about the life of Stokely Carmichael, only 2 with the man after 1973 and none that took place in the 1990s. I'm going to say that again. Joseph includes, as referenced interviews in his book about the life of Stokely Carmichael, only 2 with the man after 1973 and none that took place in the 1990s. This fits Joseph's narrative that Thuré's politics rendered him out of favor and out of touch with everyone, including most Black people. Certainly, however, this does not mean Joseph's narrative is correct in either its description of Thuré's fading popularity or why any would have occurred. Ultimately, in each case, whether previously reinterpreting Black power or now reclarifying Thuré's ideas, particularly in describing his fading popularity, Joseph functions to also obliterate context by diminishing the role of the state in any or all of these processes. Joseph seems to work with tremendous effort to diminish the impact of the state on all that happened to the individual and the Black national collective. Joseph does make routine reference throughout the text, even when briefly considering Thuré's final years, to a constant FBI and state surveillance, but only makes one passing reference to COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, which had specifically targeted Carmichael as a threat to national security. Joseph routinely describes the FBI surveillance of Thuré's post-1970 of Teray post 1970s as more comical and unnecessary, which serves Joseph's approach by allowing him to avoid having to fold into his analysis of Teray any real consideration of the state itself, why Teray or those like him would have been threats, or what states do in response to those so deemed. Joseph can then avoid any confrontation with all the documented histories of state-sponsored media campaigns to discredit threats, to promote preferred political and academic figures, and to crush even the idea of transmitting the ideas with which Teray worked to successive generations of, in particular, Black youth. Oh, that's bad. See, anyway, I'm right and the analysis is correct, but this sentence could have been better. You can't have ideas in the daggone sentence twice. Anyway. Joseph's repeated and sporadic references to seemingly natural and therefore acceptable collective shifts away from Teray make possible his eventual simple and dismissive summary of Teray's ideas and potential impact. As Kwame Ture, his radicalism appeared largely anachronistic in a post-civil rights global landscape where former militants reinvented themselves as political reformers, entrepreneurs, and elected officials. Long after Black Power's heyday, Ture insisted that America, far from being a purveyor of freedom and democracy, was in fact an empire. So this is this very kind of slick thing that Joseph does throughout his book and much of his work and approach. He claims he's doing this as an act of recovery because he admires Ture or Stokely. But as I said, he does not acknowledge what the counterintelligence program was or what it was intending to do or how it would still be in effect today or why the surveillance of Ture would have continued up until his death, so that he can avoid the politics, so he can avoid even what the state said of Ture themselves. And so that he can conclude here, as he says, that his radicalism appeared anachronistic. How is that possible? You can only say that when you're trying to show a diminishing importance to the community. The only thing that diminished was media coverage or an accurate inclusion of Ture in films like Selma, for instance, where he's completely erased. Those are the spaces where he's diminished, not in the spaces where actual activism occurs, where radical critiques occur, where people who study the history find inspiration by the ideas that they're reading. That was my point, and why I unconsciously or subconsciously had the word idea twice in one sentence, which I know is supposed to be a no-no. But that's what I'm thinking, because that Joseph didn't even want to. He wants to write a book about a man without addressing his ideas, and to do that would require, or said the other way, to include an actual analysis of what the state was doing to him. You would have to understand and include the ideas with which he worked, and Joseph doesn't want to do that. And then he says here, as he writes this as a positive, that former militants reinvented themselves as political reformers, entrepreneurs, and elected officials. In other words, becoming responsible members of the democracy, which is the underlying theme of Joseph's approach to his discussion of Ture. Not so incidentally, there is no comparison made between these, quote, former militants and those who Joseph ignores, the not so former militants, the exiled, the still imprisoned, or the assassinated. Joseph omits and therefore erases any possible consideration of the role in these shifts by the most powerful state in world history and its war against various liberation struggles. But there are no political prisoners today in Joseph's narrative. In Joseph's narrative of Ture's life, there is no discussion of COINTELPRO, so there's no need. There need not be any discussion of a conscious attempt by the state to destroy people and movements represented by Ture or in Ture. Certainly, radicalism will appear as anachronistic once the people are literally scrubbed from the streets and their ideas scrubbed from media and scholarly analyses. Claiming, even merely suggesting, that these shifts occur absent outside influence, especially given the overt nature of the state's efforts and subsequent exposure, even via Senate hearings, is disingenuous and severely flawed. And precisely how can anyone suggest Joseph's work is an attempt to clarify Ture's ideas, given his total erasure of Kwame Ture's own autobiography? I mean, this part to me was really shocking and the most obvious in reading Stokely. There's no reference, even if to be critical of. Ready for the Revolution, the autobiography of Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. Ready for Revolution, the life and struggles of Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. Stokely Carmichael with Ekwume Michael Thelwell. I don't think I'm pronouncing his African name right, but one day we'll have to do a special members only, patrons first, at least members first, patrons first discussion of my time as an Africana Studies graduate chauffeur. I'll tell you, having bartended briefly in my life, I developed an incredible appreciation for the art of remaining quiet and listening in certain settings. And I positioned myself during one of these conferences at Africana Studies Research Center at Cornell and Dr. James Turner to be a chauffeur so that I could drive everybody around during this conference and just enjoy the stories. And brother Dr. Thelwell, you know, we might have to revisit some of that. But anyway, Peniel doesn't even mention his book. How can you write a book? How can you write a book that purports to be about a person and not include any reference at all? Not one reference to the person's autobiography. Again, you can say the autobiography is flawed. You can say you're filling in gaps left out in that book's work, but to ignore it entirely is demonstrates what's going on here. I think Joseph does not bother to mention the book, never mind explain how his is an advance. There is no critique of Ready for the Revolution explaining what limitations there are in that text or how they are overcome in his own. But why bother with that? Why bother with what the man sought to leave as best he could as his final statement, when in particular doing so upsets the current attempt to reconcile the irreconcilable? For Ture to become the lesson Joseph would like him to be, for Ture to become the conduit through which today's Black leadership, political, intellectual, economic, can be seen as legitimate in their existence or justified in their behavior, Ture's own ideas must first be made history. So after spending most of his time focused on Ture's early life, recounting with no particular illumination what had already been more interestingly and thoroughly covered by Ture himself, and peppering the text with variations of his trance-inducing theme that Ture was attempting a radical transformation of American democracy, as opposed to smashing American empire, Joseph can work into his epilogue that Barack Obama's inability to comprehend the full meaning behind Ture's anti-imperialism while he was a student at Columbia in the early 1980s reflects a generational transition that Carmichael helped spur. Ture defiantly proclaimed the inevitability of a worldwide socialist revolution as a majority of the most well-known civil rights activists of his generation pragmatically adapted to new political realities that Obama would soon embrace as a national politician and the nation's first Black president. Again, reflecting back to what I said he did in Dark Days, Bright Night, whatever he was doing with that other book. This is just remarkable anti-history that, again, Joseph can get to because he ignores COINTELPRO, because he ignores the ideas and the politics involved, and he claims it is an advance that more well-known, first of all, they're more well-known civil rights leaders because they're promoted and paraded to be the negation of Ture and the radicalism that this country feared, again, having created a COINTELPRO to destroy threats to national security. But to suggest that this was, again, what Joseph is doing is suggesting that Barack Obama is the logical conclusion and that he was right. And if you read that, I mean, I remember reading that too in Obama's, again, where those of us knew well before, you know, seemingly everybody else caught up. If you just go back and read, if we, as some of us had done at the time, read what Obama had written in his own books, He was very clear. I checked out Teray, I checked out Stokely, but I'm not rocking with that. And instead of this being read as a problem, it's promoted by the mainstream and people like Joseph, mainstream academics, well positioned, promoted, and unfortunately supported by radical scholars. To my point made earlier, it's defined that transformation or that adaptation is defined here as positive. New political realities. Again, Teray is anachronistic. He's old. He's out of fashion. And the new political realities require an adaptation that would become Obama. That is just, especially looking back now, that is just unbelievable. Teray's political evolution or his receding democratic vision cannot by Joseph be interpreted as an advance. The moment Teray moves beyond voting for the lesser of evils is the moment his use shifts to that of providing the inappropriate antithesis of what is meant to replace him. Joseph does not offer the more honest assessment that Obama represents the culmination of a Nixonian process of safely reorienting Black people away from the Terays and towards the eventual Obamas. As Robert Allen once described, Nixon declared that the country must give Black people a better share of economic and political power or risk permanent social turbulence. By this, Nixon said, I speak not of Black power as some of the extremists would interpret it, but the power that comes from participation in the political and economic processes of society. In short, as Allen summarizes, Black capitalism. So the shift Carmichael helped spur was the state's conscious effort to replace his once more popular political standards, positions, analyses with those more suitable to existing power. Barack Obama's had to be cultivated from among the population in part by assassinating, imprisoning some to this day, and exiling again some to this day, so many others, thereby forcing most well-known civil rights activists to adapt pragmatically to new and imposed political realities. Stokely does not clarify Teray's ideas, nor should Joseph be seen as anyone's premier interpreter of Black power. Teray's own autobiography, with any of its imperfections, his online video, audio speeches, and lecture tapes, hip-hop mixtape tributes, even some symbolic inclusion in existing subcultures, all do better in clarifying what Teray meant by a Pan-Africanism defined by its application of scientific socialism. Teray's 1996 lecture, for one example, in solidarity with Alombe Brath and his Patrice Lumumba coalition. Please go check our recent interview with the son of Alombe, Sinke, a great discussion reminding us of the genius of Alombe Brath. Still captured by some of us on audio cassette, which can be found also online, shows Teray still able to draw a crowd, which certainly had more Black people in them than most of Joseph's book talks, and him expertly explaining the historical evolution of his ideas. There he can be heard explaining his perspective in the natural development of Pan-Africanism and the inevitability of that goal being realized. There is a debate in that same year with Malefi Asante, organized by students at the University of Cincinnati and captured on C-SPAN, which shows another packed house, many there to hear Teray brilliantly debate the efficacy of Pan-Africanism under scientific socialism for the liberation of African people versus that of Afrocentricity. Here again, even weakened and unable to stand, Teray, with great humor and intellectual dexterity, returns to appropriate relevance concepts of African unity, armed struggle, and the value of revolutionary consciousness. And in 1998, equally ignored by Joseph, is Brian Lamb's extended C-SPAN interview with Teray, in which, once again, we get clear, detailed, and fully formed exhortations from Teray about his life, politics, ideas, and contemporary updates to his analyses. These few examples and many others do perfectly fine in clarifying Teray's ideas about armed struggle, the continued reactionary impact of the state and its minions, and his broader ideas about history, philosophy, and political theory. These and other examples do far more to clarify and make plain Teray's role as public intellectual and his continuing popularity, which Joseph and his apparent political allies tirelessly attempt to deny, diminish, erase. Even in popular culture from the United States and Great Britain, we get more accurate reflections on the concept of Black power than from our supposed leading interpreter. From the recently published BBC radio documentary, Black as a Country, we can hear a young Carmichael already referring to the US as a barbaric country. And rather than hearing Joseph's strained refrain of transforming American democracy, we hear instead of Black power as a call to arms and self-defense, a call to new consciousness and peoplehood, and that it was the fire that ignited the Black arts movement, whose goal was in part the creation of a new aesthetic, new identity, new community. And even more recently, in the new HBO documentary, Mr. Dynamite, The Rise of James Brown, we are exposed to more honest reflection upon the impact of Carmichael and Black power, as well as the attempt by Nixon to redefine it as previously described. But unlike Joseph's redesigned narrative, here the Black community rejects Nixon, rejects James Brown too, and fully attempts to embrace the concept of Black power as it was intended, as a threat. Interpreters can be dangerous. Our current premier interpreter would have us rethink Black power and Kwame Ture as simultaneously immature antecedents to and having been realized in the current politics represented by Barack Obama. He wants us to read his critical biography because Ture is today largely forgotten and requires Joseph's act of recovery. But this is an act of resurrecting the condemned, recovery for future distortion or loss. It is solely a restoration to reconcile the present and distort the future. It is to remind those already outside his existing influence so as to limit his potential future impact. For whom does Ture need to be recovered? Ture is far from forgotten within the circles he worked or by the countless communities he sought to instill inspires around the world today. He is remembered in radical hip-hop commercial media, much like he is remembered in the radical hip-hop commercial media, much like commercial scholars routinely ignore. Okay, so yeah, it's strange. I struggled with that sentence too, but my point is, even in the commercial hip hop spaces, he is radically included, or his radicalism is remembered. Yeah, this is a poor. My bad, everybody. This is not well written here. My point is, he is remembered in radical hip hop, and whereas commercial media and commercial scholars routinely ignore him. He is referenced, that is, Ture is referenced countlessly by progressive journalists and scholars, and can still be found to have thousands of online video spins, and is referenced in countless online audio mixes, various non-commercial media outlets, and is found still in the iconography of old, young, and future radicals and revolutionaries. The still imprisoned Mumia Abu-Jamal described well why we are right to be concerned about who interprets our revolutionary histories in his 2007 foreword to the reissue of Stokely Speaks, From Black Power to Pan-Africanism, also demonstrating that in many circles, Ture needs no active recovery. Mumia writes, "It's amazing how those of us who consider ourselves revolutionaries still rely on the words of the white supremacist corporate press, a true enemy of the Black liberation movement if there ever was one. In the decades since the revolutionary era, we have seen how so-called radicals become liberals, and in current parlance, neoliberals, not to mention neoconservatives." Finally, an interpreter is only necessary when the initial message is unclear or unintelligible. Ture's was neither. In fact, in the omitted autobiography, Ture makes perfectly clear what he saw happening in this country, and that support for its currently constituted institutions was simply impossible. His was not a call for a Black president, nor was it support for capitalism of any kind. Ture was incapable of being put into Joseph's preferred box of trying to radically transform American democracy, for to Ture, no such thing even existed. Ture described this country as not democracy, not even plutocracy, but outright kleptocracy, where both political parties are totally owned subsidiaries of an increasingly predatory, cynical, irresponsible, and immoral corporate sector. Better still, in that same omitted C-SPAN interview, Ture was similarly clear. Black power, of course, has not been arrived at. We don't have Black power yet. We have some way to go before we get to arrive at Black power. Some people get confused and think that individual African electoral politicians equals Black power. I don't know how they come to that conclusion. You can have an African mayor of New York, and the conditions of African masses not only do not change, but can in fact become worse. His could not be a call for the next Black president or elected official, not the Touré who made clear that Black visibility is not Black power. His was not a call for getting ready, for getting, his was not a call for getting reading. Oh no. His was not a call for getting reading to give up and pragmatically redefine what it means to be radical. His was not a call for getting ready to give up. Man, what did I do here? I'm just seeing this too. Needed another edit it easily. Anyway, sorry again, everybody. His was not a call for getting reading to give up the getting for reading to give up pragmatically redefine what it means to be radicals. He did not want us to redefine become pragmatic, or to have pragmatic be redefined as the new radical. No, his was a simple and irreconcilable call: organize and be ready for the revolution.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.